Well, thank you, and welcome to this live virtual panel. The topic being how to prosper in a net zero world, and it's a session hosted by the Australian Climate Change Authority. We have a great panel of 4 speakers who will speak to the topic. And I just want to outline a little bit about the mechanics of the session, briefly introduce the speakers and hand over to them. Our four speakers will speak for around 5-6 minutes on the topic. And at the end of that presentation, I will moderate a discussion amongst the panellists, and I'll ask a series of questions. We'd also ask those listening into the conference to feel free to log a question on the chat line, and we'll try and weave those questions or the themes of those questions into the discussion as well. The session will run for an hour, and we look forward hopefully to your both interest and participation in the conference. Now, the invitation to the panel session contained a more extensive bio of each of our speakers, so I don't intend to spend a lot of time going through those, other than to say that they're all eminently qualified to talk to the subject. Brad Archer, as CEO of the Climate Change Authority, has had a long background in government and government policy in the area of energy and climate, and has been leading the Climate Change Authority for a few years here in Australia. He'll be followed by Guy Debelle, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. Guy's been very prominent in Australia in promoting, if you don't mind me saying, Guy, economic literacy amongst the community, and been a key contributor, a major contributor to important public policy or public debates around economic policy and the importance of a strong economy to our country. Jennifer Westacott has been involved in both public and private sector for many, many years and has dealt with, and I know from experience, many of the thorniest issues to come across the table. Most recently, of course, the business response to the COVID pandemic, and of course the enduring issue of climate change. And finally, we've got Stephen Fitzgerald, who's well known to Australians from his experience in the banking and finance sector, but particularly his role in founding and chairing affirmative investment management, which has really been an early mover and leader in this topic. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Brad Archer, and allow Brad to introduce the topic and the work of the CCA. Thank you, Brad. Over to you.
Thanks, Grant. So I think our starting point is that strong global action to reduce the risks of climate change is very much in Australia's interests. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment report on climate science makes abundantly clear that urgent action is necessary if the world is to have any chance of meeting the Paris Agreement goals. Global emissions have in fact risen since the Paris Agreement was struck, pausing only recently for the economic impacts of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in recent years, we have seen important trends emerging overseas and in Australia, and including in Australia's major trade and investment partners. Trends that reflect businesses, consumers and governments increasingly favouring lower emissions products and investment opportunities. So I think the first thing we can say is that's very welcome. But secondly, this increasing momentum towards net zero presents both challenges and opportunities for the Australian economy. A key theme of the Climate Change Authority's recent reports is that for Australia, these trends mean that reducing emissions as quickly as possible will be absolutely vital. And that's not just to play our part in addressing climate change, as we should, but for our economy to be competitive and to prosper as the world decarbonises. So what are these trends that we're seeing? Well, we're seeing large global funds managers, such as BlackRock, Macquarie, HSBC and a host of others, adopting net zero by 2050 commitments for their investment portfolios. We've seen over 100 major banks and institutional investors place restrictions on lending to new coal projects. Companies are voluntarily adopting emissions reductions targets, and together with, or perhaps at the insistence of, financial regulators, are beginning to focus on managing climate-related risks. Sustainable debt financing has increased substantially, from around $30 billion US back in 2012 to around $730 billion US in 2020. And in terms of government responses, well, we're seeing the EU and others looking at taxing emissions-intensive imports through such mechanisms as carbon border adjustment schemes. And governments also, such as in the UK, are deciding what qualifies as a green investment to guide flows of sustainable finance. Now, why are these trends important to Australia? Well, because quite simply, trade and investment are important for our economic performance. Our exports are equivalent to almost a quarter of our gross domestic product or total output. Now, when we think about the future of our exports, we have to note that some of our biggest export earners from the fossil fuel and farm sectors are highly emissions intensive. In fact, almost 40% of Australia's total domestic emissions are associated with the production of our exports. But that's not where the story ends. When our coal and gas exports are combusted overseas, the emissions are 3 times as much as the emissions that occur here in Australia in total. And we have other exports that also have high emissions downstream. For example, our iron ore and bauxite when turned into steel and aluminium. Now, in relation to investment, we are a net importer of capital, and more than 1/3 of our foreign direct investment flows into our mining sector. So in a world that's increasingly taking strong action to decarbonise, reducing our own emissions is a necessary source of competitive advantage for our growth and our prosperity. It's necessary to attract the foreign capital we need and necessary to ensure our exports remain competitive. Now, these trade and investment trends are definitely coming off a low base. They have to strengthen and by a lot if the Paris Agreement is to be successful. The International Energy Agency has demonstrated the scale of the task, suggesting we require a tripling of global low carbon investment to around $2.4 trillion a year if we are to get to net zero by 2050. From an Australian perspective, these trends are already having an impact, and their importance for jobs and growth in our economy can only increase. The decisions being made overseas are just as important for us as the decisions we make here in Australia. The good news is that we have many opportunities in this global transition to net zero, starting with our extensive renewable energy resources, our deposits of critical minerals, which are important for clean technologies, and our vast landscapes. Now, the Australian government's latest emissions projections paint a fairly optimistic outlook for emissions to 2030. Most of this progress is happening in the electricity sector, with a strong continued growth in the share of renewables. And that lays a great foundation for reducing emissions elsewhere in the economy. And that's the challenge and the opportunity that we have to bend the curve more steeply for every other sector, to get emissions down, jobs and GDP up, and to get to net zero as soon as possible. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, Grant.
Thanks very much, Brad. And what we'd now like to do is pass the microphone, so to speak, on to Guy Debelle, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. Over to you, Guy.
Thanks very much, Grant. I'd like to pick up on some of the points that Brad just made in terms of the impact on the Australian economy from the macro point of view. And then I just want to spend some time talking about the financial aspects that are very important in this space as well. But let me start on the macro side of things. So Brad very much highlighted a number of the transition challenges that the Australian economy faces as the world, and including Australia, transitions to net zero. But I'd also, before we think about the transition risks, I think it's also worth thinking about the physical risks to the Australian macroeconomy, which have been ever present, but are intensifying in recent years, and we've seen more and more evidence of climatic events having a material effect on the Australian macroeconomy, and large enough to be a macro force rather than necessarily localised to local communities, which is devastating for them, but we're now starting to see it increasingly have large-scale macro impacts, with the bushfires being a very recent example, which probably still is strongly in people's minds. So we have those ever-present physical risks, which seem to be which are getting larger and more intense and more frequent. But Brad also highlighted the transition risks as the world transitions to net zero. And one of the issues that I think is worth picking up on that Brad highlighted was really the impact of the policies of our trading partners, and particularly our trading partners in the energy space. So all of our trading partners, who are all present in Glasgow now in one form or another, have announced net zero policies. At the moment, we don't have a strong idea as to how exactly they're going to implement those net zero policies. But we're expecting to get more and more granularity on that in the period ahead, if not even in the week ahead. And that will start to crystallise the transition risks that face the Australian economy, particularly in the energy export sector. But particularly in the fossil fuel energy export sector is where those costs are most likely to be prevalent. But at the same time, as Brad highlighted, we have the opportunity to still remain very much an energy exporter to the rest of the world, but energy exports of a different form, a renewable and sustainable form. And that opportunity is very much in front of us, and we are starting to see that being realised in different parts of the country. But there is plenty more scope for that to occur in the period ahead, and a large amount of opportunity there for us. But we do run the risk, if we drag our feet, that others will get there before us. And I think there is a large first mover, or at least early mover advantage, which we run the risk of squandering if we don't move ahead. So I think it's very important in this space to highlight the opportunity. A lot of this is always framed in terms of the cost. And there are two costs. There are definitely the costs, particularly to those local communities, of the impact of that transition. There's also the cost of the country as a whole of not doing anything, particularly of the world not doing anything. And that's manifest in the physical risks that we actually have seen play out in recent years. But at the same time, and including very much to the same communities where the costs may be borne the most, is often where the opportunities are the greatest. And I mentioned a couple of weeks back a good example of this, which is my home state of South Australia, where Port Augusta, which was very much on the receiving end of the cost of this transition, is now very much benefiting from it as it's moved very effectively, I think, into the renewable space. So I think it is very much important in this debate to highlight that the opportunities are there, but we need to take advantage of them, and we need to take advantage of them ahead of others. And we do have a comparative advantage in this space if we move ahead. Let me now just talk a little bit about the financial side of things. And an important part of the transition is that the transition needs to be financed. It's not going to just happen. It actually needs finance behind it. And at the moment, there's a very large pool of funds looking to finance those transition opportunities. And the GANS Alliance that Mark Carney is chairing is, sitting on, according to Mark, at least $100 trillion worth of funds looking to be deployed in this space, which is a pretty large number. And it'd be useful if we could actually avail ourselves of some of those funds with some of these projects. So the capital needs to be deployed, and it needs to be deployed effectively. But for that to occur, there needs to be effective information to be able to make those decisions appropriately. And I think we still have some way to go in that space, both in Australia, but also globally. And again, this week in Glasgow, there's some important steps forward in that space. And one I would highlight is the TCFD, which is putting out much more granular information around disclosures. And a lot, as chair of the Council of Financial Regulators group on financing climate change, and together with ASIC, very much like to repeat the message that TCFD disclosures, we think, are the appropriate way for the Australian corporate sector to disclose their climate risks. TCFD, I think either probably later today, will announce with IFRS that they're moving ahead to incorporate the TCFD disclosures into the global accounting standards. So this, we've seen a plethora of different propositions around disclosure, but I do think the world is now coalescing towards one, which is based on the TCFD, will be in the global accounting standards. Very much the path that we think Australian corporates should move down. And a number of them actually are, as of, we think that around about 80 of the top ASX top 200 companies in Australia make TCFD disclosures. In many cases, they've got to them willingly, but in a number of cases, they've got there because they have no choice. The world, these companies have moved on from asking whether or not to disclose to the important question of how to disclose. And it is very important that we have that information out there in a comparable and consistent way, both within Australia and globally. So that is something that we, as the Australian financial regulatory community, are working with the corporate sector on, particularly with the financial sector on, in getting that information, identifying those information gaps, and where we can, trying to redress those information gaps. And that's something we're certainly focusing on with APRA and the 5 largest Australian banks in the climate vulnerability assessment that we're conducting currently. And we're looking to have that information in the public domain not too far into the new year, which again should be a useful building block to inform those corporate disclosures. We at the Reserve Bank are looking at that particularly from providing a macro overlay to that climate vulnerability assessment, which again is something that many corporates have asked to have more guidance on. So we will be looking to put that out in the new year to provide that basis for consistency and the quality of disclosures by corporate Australia. So let me finish there, Grant, but really highlighting this is a great opportunity for Australia. We shouldn't just be focusing on the costs of action by others or the costs of inaction, but very much focusing on the opportunities which are there in front of us. But that does need to be financed, and for that finance to be deployed effectively, we do need both usable and comparable information.
Guy, thank you very much for those comments. And I'd now like to pass on to Jennifer Westacott, the CEO of the Business Council of Australia. And Jennifer, over to you for some opening thoughts and comments.
Thanks, Grant. Look, I'm going to talk about the Business Council's plan to achieve net zero. I'm going to give a bit of a perspective on how business sees the opportunities that Guy and Brad have talked about and the challenges ahead, and what business is doing in Australia to lead on climate action. A couple of weeks ago, the Business Council of Australia released its plan to achieve a net zero economy by 2050. I think our fundamental starting point is that the science is in, financial markets are moving, the global momentum is unstoppable, and there's tremendous consensus now in the business community that this represents much more of that opportunity. There's tremendous consensus about the importance of taking climate action, and there's a growing level of ambition and commitment to decarbonise Australian businesses. The issue is, of course, as others are saying, the how. We think that critical to this effort is to put in place a durable framework that brings forward investment and deployment of commercially viable technology now, especially in electricity, and then starts to send the investment signals to develop the technologies to decarbonise the harder to abate sectors and industries. So we've put forward a pretty comprehensive plan to do this. And I think it's important to say that our plan is backed by business, it's written by business, and it represents a broad cross-section of the economy, whether it's miners, generators, retailers, consumers, manufacturers, and financiers. We worked on this for 2 years. We consulted over 70 of Australia's largest companies. And so it's business's plan, effectively, because it's our view that business has to lead this change. So we've put forward a comprehensive architecture that we think is going to drive the right private sector investment. So it begins by government commitment to net zero to give that certainty, and obviously the Australian government has taken that decision. We propose 10-year carbon budget with 5-year reviews. We want to see a bigger ambition in the 2030 interim target. I'll talk about that in a minute. We want to see one of the major tools of the architecture in Australia, that what's called the safeguard mechanism,